adjustments with blade guards, back setting, things of that nature. Same generic rules. Tech should only be switching out blades. This one does not have a colored grip plate, actually as well as that one, but it's the same generic rule. You don't ever want your hand to enter into this basic cutting zone, and you should, for the most part, be fine. Has a fence, which can be adjusted for getting relatively accurate parallel cuts. Again, if you really are looking for something like that, the table saw is much more efficient at that, but you can still do a good variety of things too. So yeah, as I was saying, like, you could set up a saw in different ways to do different jobs, but there's also different band saws that are just more suited for particular styles of cutting. This particular saw is basically a milling bandsaw. It's got a big, heavy-duty blade on it with a much bigger throat opening than most bandsaws, and that's so that you can get big architectural beams through, you get big logs through, all those things. And again, you see the width and thickness of this blade, and that's because it's really just meant for doing straight shots. And that's going to allow you to mill boards, resaw things. So say you have a board that's 1 inch thick and you want to get 3/4 inch pieces out of it. You could get it a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch on this, and then take it over to the planer and have exact boards out of one piece. So it's also a way to like extend material, do all that kind of things. Whereas this smaller, slightly smaller bandsaw, again, is going to be way better for doing more organic cuts, sort of things that have curves, things of that nature. We also have a really tiny little bandsaw over in the corner, and that one's really just best used for thin material that really is very organic. And that's because of the three, it has the smallest blade that in turn has the most flexibility, but has the least amount of cutting power. So by no means would we ever want to re-mill a board over here, but say, yeah, you had very thin material and you had a very, very organic shape, this would be the perfect bandsaw for it. And so, I think after that, it's basically just to the sanders. I'm going to forego this one because this thing is just dangerous and shouldn't even be here, if I'm being honest. But yeah, we have 3 different kinds of sanders and foam sanders. But yeah, we have the oscillating spindle sander, which basically, but yeah, as the name sounds, it basically oscillates up and down while also rotating. It comes in a big variety of different widths, I think going from 1/4 inch all the way to I think 4 inches is our biggest one. With we have different varieties of grits for each size, starting at 60 grit, going up to I think 220. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done on this. A lot of sort of fine sanding and sort of it's like a mixture between sculpting and just defining shapes, basically. But in between those rough cuts and that final touch that you're going to put on it, these are kind of the purposes. So yeah, we have basically a belt sander and a disc grinder, and yeah, this is very straightforward. It's very, very similar to a belt sander. It's basically just not attached to a triggering mechanism. So you use the vent, you use the bed, and that's true for all of these. You don't ever want to see people kind of doing one of these numbers, because again, just like with everything, all the arrows on here are showing a directional nature to things. So as soon as you're kind of here, it's literally going to want to throw your material down. And that's why you're actually going to let the bed of the machine dictate the lack of movement that you want, right? So you don't want it to go down. That's why you put it here, and that's actually going to give you your power, because then it's just going to be abrading against that, and there's nothing that's going to throw it, and that's going to give you a lot more accuracy. This one's pretty straightforward. It just has one directional motion. All you have to do is just make sure that you're actually staying within the belt. And there's some stuff here with adjustments. Again, belts should be changed out by techs, and eventually we'll get to the point where hopefully I can get everyone trained on how to actually track the belt. And that basically is talking about this top column here that's actually, you know, the belt's actually riding over it. You want to keep this from sliding in one direction or the other, and the way that you do that is actually these fine adjustments here. And what that's doing is, if you can imagine a bar on this side, it's basically going to adjust one end to the other, and that's basically going to shift the belt to one direction or the other. And eventually, that's what you call tracking. It's something you do on a bandsaw, it's something you do on belt-driven machines. Is you basically want to try to help it find its center, so that once you apply pressure, that's not going to throw the belt off in one direction. Same thing. All these come in a variety of grits from 60 grit to 220. This one here is a little bit more of a dangerous one because it has the appearance that you can sand all the way across it. In my opinion, there should be a guard here. That's okay. And the reason is the same exact theory in physics as the table saw. So you have one end that's picking things up and you have one thing that's putting things down, right? And just like we talked about, you want to have your material flat on the bed. Now, coming from the center point to the left side, that's a downward rotation. So anytime I'm from the center point going to the left, it's going to keep my material flat, and it's also going to allow me to kind of like fuss with it and get all these intricate little curves. But if I was to do that on this side, anywhere from the center to the right, it's literally just going to pick that material up and probably end up somewhere in the wall. So that's one easy thing to watch out for. Again, I think this is probably the most, in terms of safety for your hands, it's the most simple. Again, the whole theory is that we want to keep our hands the furthest away from the machines that we're trying to use, right, in relation to the material. We want the material to get eaten by the machines in our hands. So the last one is the horizontal edge sander, and definitely is exactly what the name makes it up to be. So the whole concept is that you have sort of a raggedy edge, maybe because you couldn't put it on the joiner, or it's too small, or it's just in a very particular setting where you just can't get it to it any other way, and you don't want to risk doing a hand sanding. That may sort of give you an uneven edge or a little undulation or something along it. And basically, that's what this is exactly for. You're going to just gently come up to it. And as long as you're applying even pressure, gentle, even pressure, it's going to just barely sand that edge down to a completely flat surface because of this long, nice surface here that we have to work on. And the one thing that can be dangerous about this is in two ways. If you try to apply too much force at once, basically you're offsetting the rotation, the power that it has, right? Because you're trying to take something that is in motion and push it up against something that is. So it doesn't care. It's going to keep trying to spin. So it's just going to throw your material when you do that. So all you're going to do is just as gently as you can, you're just going to literally let it start to graze it and just let the machine do the work, right? Work smarter, not harder. And you're just literally going to let it rest, and then eventually we'll bring it all down and kind of creep right to that point that you want to. Same thing. 3 to 4 different varieties of belts on that, from 60 grit to 220. And then, yeah, I think actually for the most part, yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah. No, the chop saw. Yeah, and then the chop saw. I think for the most part, this is probably the most generic tool that we have in here. Most people who are working in a shop have used this at some point in their life, or a version of it. Very sort of straightforward, plug and play, where you have a trigger. Sometimes you'll even have a safety mechanism that you first have to engage and then the trigger. This is a combination compound sliding miter saw. So that means that not only can we extend it out to get a full range of cut, but I can also stop at multiple depths to do sort of channel cuts or rabbit cuts or things of that nature. Basically trying to bore things out, or also step through material. A lot of times what you'll see people do is like in a 5-inch thick block, just bury down through it, and you're again in that same thing we were talking about with the planer and the joiner and the table saw. You really want to try to work things down gradually and not force the blades through. And so in that same way, if I had a 5-inch block, I could come and do 1/8 inch, come back, go down another 1/8, cut all the way through. And my blade would stay sharp, I had a really nice clean cut and no struggle in between. And that's the basic concept of it. But again, where you have colored throat plate, keep your hands away. Another sort of basic rule as well is, you know, you can get away with it sometimes where you're coming and chopping a little piece here, but I think a good general rule is that you always maintain contact with both sides of the fences. Because what can also happen is when people try to sort of get little bits and pieces that may be barely resting on this, there may be a relativity that we can come with that makes a lot of sense. But say this was only this big, I would never want to cut this like this, because what's going to happen is there's not enough of this piece, which I think is more related to a center line of the mass of the piece, to keep it from spinning out. And what's going to happen is, again, we have a rotational blade that's going this direction, basically back towards it. And what's going to happen is, because there's nothing keeping it from going, as soon as I make contact with it, it's going to spin out of the way and it's going to throw itself back. You're going to hear a loud noise, it's going to seem terrible. If you're lucky, your hand's not going to be caught up with it, because if you're trying to really desperately grab onto that piece and it throws itself, you're probably still attached to it. So again, that's where ideally your hands are completely outside of the throat plate on one half of the material holding it in place. And it's also making contact with the second side, so that once the piece is cut, it actually has a place to land and safely sit without it being basically a hazard, throwing hazard for the machine. There's also definitely a variety of different kinds of blades that we have for this one, depending on the material, and you can also do some cross cut, some rip cutting with this, just depending on the actual size of your piece and the direction that you're trying to go in.
Can you show any like angle adjustments or locks on there?
Yeah, definitely. And this is definitely something that's true actually for all these tools. Just because you know how one machine works doesn't mean that you're gonna even have the slightest clue with the next one, because every one of these mechanisms is entirely different from the next, whether it's a double safety mechanism on the blade. Like for instance, this one has a double lockdown for the angle setting, so you actually release this first, and then you have to actually adjust this by pulling it down, and then you can adjust. That one. And yeah, so most of these go from a variable of 65 degrees on either side. Some will be 65 on the left and 45 on the right. But yeah, for most cases you can get most of your cuts done. And what's cool is, with a little bit of math, say you need actually a 75 degree cut, you just do inverse angularity and basically flip that on its head and do the do the difference of the two angles and be able to get your cut done. So basically, the majority of what you can do can be done on this. I would say that this is probably one of the least accurate tools that we have, probably after the bandsaw. But in terms of like doing miter cuts and things like that, that's also something that we can do with the table saw. There's all kinds of jigs and different things that we can do with the table saw. Sure. And then that's also kind of one important thing to mention, is that as far as jigs go, actually for anything, because they can definitely be set up for chop saws, for band saws, for sanding, for the regular table saw. We have pre-approved jigs that we've built and tested that we know are safe. If an artist or member wants to make a jig, that's fine. But basically, a tech has to basically, I think, either sort of be around in the use of it the first few times, or actually be there to sort of approve the jigs. Basically, so that people aren't improperly building jigs that actually create dangerous scenarios. A jig should actually make a system safer for you, not create more danger.
Cool. You have the strength to go through the tool closet over there?
So yeah, the good thing is that the majority of these tools in here are actually just smaller versions of everything that we talked about. So, same concept, you have a skill saw. So we have a couple different skill saws. This one's actually called a worm drive skill saw. And basically this is made for much thicker material, or maybe material that has sort of, basically grain that sort of crosses over one another, and what that does is that it will create a lot of tension on the blade, because as you're cutting, instead of it leaving an even gap, which should be the width of the blade, it actually has so much tension within the board that it tries to force itself back closed, and that can pinch on the blade. And for instance, on a smaller scale saw or something like this, that's where you get a lot of binding. But for instance, this is really great for dimensional lumber, plywood, things of that nature. But something where if you're doing like a 2-inch thick board of walnut or something like that, you're really going to want to do more drive steel saw, because that's just going to power through. The second that it bogs down, it actually has a preset in the engine to sort of kick into overdrive and power through. So it's a great tool for that. Another kind of, yeah, okay. And so again, you have the basic principles of the table saw with blade rotation, basically awareness of your hands, in some of the settings where basically you have an angularity setting to where you can actually go on an angle away from 90, which is set at now. And then you also have a blade height adjustment, so where I can have more or less of the blade exposed through, depending on the style of cut that I'm doing. Kind of the same theory goes with that, where if I'm doing hardwood or something like that, I'm going to have the blade exposed the least that I can. And if I'm putting plywood, I'm actually going to have it ripped way open so that I'm getting a better quality cut. Then we have belt sanders, which again, definitely is sort of the basic same concept as that vertical belt sander. Again, you have tracking. And with that one, that's about it. This is a little bit more plug and play, and you can definitely get more aggressive. This is really for boring out material. Say you have freeform cutting to do, or sculpting, something of that nature, this is great for that. Or just a situation where you made a boo-boo and you need to fix it. It's great for that. Yeah. Basically, this is a good version of both the planer and joiner. This can be used as either. This is an electric hand plane, which is the exact same system. It's just a handheld version of it. It has blades, basically. You can see here, it's kind of hard to see maybe, but it's a small single blade that's exposed there. It will act in the same way as a planer or joiner. You can lay it flat and run it through. It's definitely not as accurate in some cases, and I think this is more of like a relativity to experience and skill with the particular tool. There are people that can totally do as good of a job with this as what that planer can do. I cannot, and most people when they first pick it up can't.